Welcome to ASML Monopoly. In this video today, we will be looking at the EU will not survive without Russia. 3 times alarm from Merkel to EU and America. So clearly, you do not want to miss out on this. So, let's begin. Russia's military aggression against Ukraine has brought several sanctions against them by the US and the EU. However, Russia hit back by reducing supplies from the Nord Stream 1 gas pipeline. Considering that Russia supplies about 40% of the EU's natural gas and 27% of its oil, the reduction in supplies hit EU members' countries badly. Russian gas has been attractive to Europe because it was easy to transport and almost always available. Its significance increased recently as several nations attempted to stop the production of coal and nuclear power, and as production from their gas fields decreased. Before the conflict in Ukraine disrupted supplies and highlighted the danger of relying too heavily on one energy source. Nearly a third of the gas consumed in Europe was supplied by the state-controlled Russian business Gazprom. Although the EU had plans to rid itself of Russian oil and gas by 2030, it is still heavily reliant on Russian exports, and Russia has taken full advantage of this. Following more sanctions, Russia altogether closed supplies from the Nord Stream 1 pipeline to EU countries as a way to hit back at them. 2 leaks were discovered in the Nord Stream 1 pipeline in August, which meant that the pipeline became closed, and recently the Nord Stream 2 pipeline also met the same fate. This has reduced gas supplies all over Europe, with many countries facing an energy crisis ahead of winter. Despite no official statement from Russia as to their involvement in the alleged sabotage of these pipelines, many experts and EU leaders have blamed Russia. And why not? They stand to gain the most if the supply of gas is interrupted, and this may be a strategy to force the EU to reduce their support for Ukraine in this war. What changed as a result of the war? And how did Russia become so significant? How vulnerable is Europe? Let's find out. Rarely in its history has Europe been as united as it's been in the midst of the war in Ukraine. The majority of the media in Europe and almost all European nations are in favor of Ukraine. It is also noteworthy that US and European positions in the Ukraine conflict are completely the same. Both US and the EU use the same narrative and terminology. President Vladimir Putin's desire to restore the glories of the former Soviet Empire includes Russia's unjustified war against Ukraine. Few could have imagined a decade ago that Europe would witness a war between a nation that is not ashamed of its soldiers, wearing tattoos of Nazi symbols, and a former communist country. A war ostensibly and about the energy that received support from both the political left of the European Union and the Greens. In late February, Putin launched what he called a special military operation for the demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine. In his speech, Putin questioned Ukraine's right to be a sovereign nation and made the untrue allegation that the country was run by neo-Nazis who oppressed the ethnic Russian minority. Within minutes of his speech, airstrikes, missiles, and rockets struck Ukraine's capital city of Kiev as well as other regions, and then a sizable ground invasion from many different directions. The US, EU, and the rest of the international community responded swiftly by condemning Russia's attacks. The West even went as far as trying to find an amicable solution, but there was no going back for Putin. He was determined to obliterate Ukraine, to unite it with Russia as one. The Russian public generally believed in his vision, as many of them still had sentiments of the old Soviet Union when Russia was at its peak. The West responded to Putin's invasion with several sanctions meant to cripple the Russian economy and force the stubborn Putin to sue for peace. The US and the rest of Europe began confiscating the assets of the Russian oligarchs, who were believed to be financing the Russian government. Most of these oligarchs lost billions of money and assets in European countries and the United States. Other sanctions, including banking sanctions, crippled Russian banks and isolated Russia's economy from the rest of the world, leading to a steady decline in the Russian economy. In many ways, the West's strategy towards Russia since 1991 has been naive, and the strategy employed in this war was too harsh on a country that most of Europe depended on for its oil and gas. There was no way Russia was going to take this hit on its economy without a significant response against the West. Therefore, Russia knew the power it had and used it. In August, Russia reduced the gas it was exporting to Europe through the Nord Stream 1 pipeline, and this resulted in a hike in energy prices all over Europe as scarcity loomed. Furthermore, Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 were sabotaged, and this led to a complete shutdown of distribution. The EU has been in a state of panic ever since, and they continue to try and find other alternatives every day. This crisis has shown an underlying issue affecting the EU for years: its over-reliance on Russia for gas. The European Union developed a strategy to reduce its reliance on Russian gas by 2/3 by the end of 2022 after Russia invaded Ukraine. After being subject to harsh sanctions, Russia struck back. President Vladimir Putin signed an order requiring that any purchases made from unfriendly nations be made in rubles beginning in April. To manage their payments, they would need to create unique accounts with Russia's Gazprom bank JSC in both foreign currency and rubles. Customers in Poland, Bulgaria, Denmark, Finland, and the Netherlands had their gas switched off for refusing to adhere to the new rules. Later, Russia cut off exports via its main pipeline to the continent, even to those who had discovered ways around the new payment order. Customers in Germany, Italy, France, and Austria consequently did not receive all of the gas they had requested. With its numerous Siberian oil fields, Russia had the world's largest reserves of natural gas. Starting in the 1990s, trade between the EU and Russia increased from a few $billion annually to $207 billion by 2021. With a share of 37.3% of Russia's total international commerce in goods, the EU was the nation's top trading partner in 2020. The EU accounted for 36.5% of Russia's imports and 37.9% of its exports. In addition, Europe and Russia constructed a vast network of pipelines from central Russia that transported gas and oil to northern, central, and southern Europe between the 1990s and the 2020s. It was unquestionably the biggest energy infrastructure undertaking ever. However, various U.S. administrations raised a red flag that Europe was growing overly dependent on Russian energy, particularly its natural gas. Angela Merkel, the German chancellor at the time, and many other European nations that joined the pipeline network had no such reservations. With benchmark prices more than tripling, a shortage supply in 2021 gave insight into Europe's dependency on Russian gas. As a result of extensive maintenance work being done in North Sea fields and the redirection of the supply of liquefied natural gas to fulfill the rising demand in Asia, stockpiles in the EU reached a record low. Due to the threat to Russian supply in 2022, European LNG imports were accelerated, domestic producers pledged to maintain maximum output, and EU buyers accessed additional supplies from Africa to Central Asia. Russian quantities, however, were still too big to be completely replaced in the short term. The largest link from Russia to the EU, the Nord Stream pipeline, saw its flows drop by nearly 60% in mid-June that year, as some utilities struggled to stay afloat and major industrial users thought about taking energy-saving measures. It is obvious that this course of action taken by Russia will affect the EU and Europe negatively. Although the EU, through concerted efforts, is looking for alternatives in the short term to help manage the increasing demand. However, it won't be an easy search for the EU, as the amount of gas needed will be hard to obtain from other countries outside the EU. Moreover, landlocked countries in Eastern and Central Europe are more susceptible to Russian gas disruptions than countries in Western and Southern Europe, since they have fewer options. In 2021, nearly 40% of Italy's need was met by Russian supply, but Italy has been searching the world for alternatives and has signed new contracts with suppliers, mainly in North Africa. The cost of losing Russia will be too much to calculate. According to the gloomy predictions, Europe will experience deindustrialization, a massive loss of investment capital, and a sharp decline in living standards. The grim forecasts are justified when you consider the precarious financial situation of several EU countries, as well as the inflation that has yet to be controlled. Europe will be all by itself by the time it takes stock of the situation and wonders why its political class crushed a ceasefire agreement between Russia and Ukraine. Do you think the EU made the right decision by deciding to double down on Russia? How badly do you think the war will affect the EU? Do you think these countries will get enough gas supplies in time for winter? Let us know in the comment section below.